George Orwell said, "The further society drifts from the truth, the more it will hate those that speak it." Today I want to look at a time when the Apostle Paul brought the truth to one of the world's foremost centers of thought and science in recorded history, in Acts 17. And that's Athens, Greece. So if you'll flip over to Acts 17, we'll read that in a little bit. But first, a little bit about Athens and Greece in general. Just from a worldly perspective, this seems like one of the best places you could ever preach the gospel. There were philosophers hanging around the marketplace, trying to discover truth, and philosophers are supposed to be seekers of wisdom, so this seems like a gold mine, again, from a worldly perspective. It was the heart of Western cultural development and had many scientific achievements that we still think about and use today. And we'll read it, but Paul addressed at least two groups of philosophers that day that are still known in philosophic circles, and even if you're not familiar with those particular schools, you're certainly familiar with some of their tenets, which we'll look at a little bit later as well. So just some of the accomplishments that they came up with. One, Aristarchus, he lived at 310 to 230 BC and concluded the earth revolves around the sun. Euclid, about 300 BC, was a mathematician and systematized geometry. Archimedes, a mathematician and physicist, discovered important principles regarding the lever, the pulley, and specific gravity. And then, like Pythagoras and others. And one I wanted to mention with regards to medicine, Hippocrates is probably the most famous research doctor of all time. The Hippocratic Oath is still it's common for doctors to take that, which is named after him. He was the first known medical practitioner in recorded history to categorize illnesses as acute, chronic, endemic, and epidemic. And he also taught that ailments were caused by natural things at a time when people believed that everything was punishment from the gods. Not terribly. I think it's interesting also that his original Hippocratic Oath prohibited euthanasia and abortion, and today only 14% of medical oaths prohibit euthanasia and 8% prohibit abortion, according to Howard Markle, an article on the Hippocratic Oath in the New England Journal of Medicine, Massachusetts Medical Society. So it's pretty impressive what they were able to accomplish. Not to mention, everybody is familiar with Homer's writings. Anybody not read the Iliad or the Odyssey at some point through school? And are there more famous thinkers than Socrates, Aristotle, or Plato? They've been influencing thought since their time. So it wasn't unreasonable to say that Athens was the birthplace of Western thought, Western culture, and it grew out of it, and it's still remembered for its accomplishments today. And that's where Paul was able to preach the gospel. Some of the other things they came up with, or at least developed, democracy, standardized medicine, trial by jury, and organized science and mathematics. They also had significant contributions to architecture, the theater, and the Olympics. Unfortunately, later on, the Olympics would be kind of corrupted to include really boring events like figure skating and artistic swimming, but they can't really be held responsible for that. So, at the time Paul visited it, Athens was a little past its prime, but still world-renowned, and it seems like the perfect place for people the perfect place to speak the truth from a worldly perspective. So if you will, let's read. I'm going to read Acts 17, verses 16, I think through the end of the chapter. Now while Paul waited for them at Athens, his spirit was stirred in him when he saw the city wholly given to idolatry. Therefore disputed he in the synagogue with the Jews and with the devout persons, and in the market daily with them that met with him. Then certain philosophers of the Epicureans and of the Stoics encountered him, and some said, "What will this babbler say?" And others some, "He seemeth to be a setter forth of strange gods, because he preached unto them Jesus and the resurrection." And they took him and brought him unto Areopagus, saying, May we know what this new doctrine whereof thou speakest is? For thou bringest certain strange things to our ears. We would know, therefore, what these things mean. For all the Athenians and strangers which were there spent their time in nothing else but to tell or to hear some new thing. Then Paul stood in the midst of Mars Hill and said, Ye men of Athens, I perceive that in all things ye are too superstitious. For as I passed by and beheld your devotions, I found an altar with this inscription, To the unknown God. Whom therefore ye ignorantly worship, him declare I unto you. God that made the world and all things therein, seeing that he is the Lord of heaven and earth, dwelleth not in temples made with hands, neither is worshipped with men's hands, as though he needed anything, seeing he giveth life to all life and breath and all things. He hath made of one blood all nations of men that dwell on the face of the earth, and hath determined the times before appointed, and the bounds of their habitation, that they should seek the Lord, if haply they might feel after him and find him, though he be not far from every one of us. For in him we live and move and have our being, as certain also of your own poets have said, for we are also his offspring. Forasmuch then we are the offspring of God, we ought not to think that the Godhead is like unto gold or silver or stone, graven by art and man's device. And the times of this ignorance God winked at, but now commandeth all men everywhere to repent, because he hath appointed a day in the which he will judge the world in righteousness by that man whom he hath ordained. Wherefore he hath given assurance to all men, in that he raised him from the dead.
Your mic is going.
Yeah, I don't know why.
It's too low.
So I was getting a lot of, it sounded like it was clipping when I had it up higher. So we'll try that and see. Okay. Because he hath appointed a day in the which...
It's still going. Might need new batteries in the transmitter.
Check the batteries.
Well, let's see. If I put it over here, I wonder if it makes a difference. It shouldn't make a difference in my pocket, but I don't know. Sorry? Oh. Okay, well, I guess we'll just press on and see how it goes. Verse 31, because he hath appointed a day in the which he will judge the world in righteousness by that man whom he hath ordained, whereof he hath given assurance unto all men, in that he raised him from the dead. And when they heard of the resurrection of the dead, some mocked, and others said, We will hear thee again of this matter. So Paul departed from among them. Howbeit certain men clave unto him, and believed, among the which was Dionysius the Areopagite, and a woman named Damaris, and others with them. So, it doesn't really go the way you would have thought if you just looked at it from a strictly worldly perspective and didn't think about any of the verses you probably know that specifically name the Greeks. And what happened that day is the same thing that happens today when people hear the gospel. Some mock, some delay, and others, a few, stick with the truth. And back then, like today, we have people who believe in science, but not the God who created it. And it turns out that most of these Greeks were more interested in the wisdom of how this world works, not in the truth of how it came to be. As we see in 1 Corinthians 1:22. For the Jews require a sign, and the Greeks seek after wisdom, but we preach Christ crucified. Unto the Jews a stumbling block, and unto the Greeks foolishness. So today I wanted to really, really quickly look at philosophy from 30,000 feet, and then look at these two groups of philosophers that Paul ran into that day, what they believed, what they thought, what they understood, and what they missed. And then after that, I wanted to take a few of the Stoics and look at some of the truth they had and see how that compares with the Bible. And I think I found it to be very interesting, so I hope you will as well. So, philosophy means the love of wisdom, from the Greek philosophia, which is the love of wisdom. There are four main branches of philosophy: epistemology, ethics, logic, and metaphysics. Epistemology is the philosophical analysis of the nature of knowledge, sources of knowledge, and justified belief. The structure and body of knowledge that we have, or justified belief, and also skepticism, which questions the possibility of knowledge. Ethics is, it deals with the questions of human morality, defining concepts such as good, evil, right, wrong, virtue and vice, justice and crime. Logic is a systematic study of valid rules of inference, which means the relations that lead to the acceptance of one proposition, the conclusion, on the basis of a set of another proposition called the premise or premises. More broadly, logic is the analysis and appraisal of arguments. And lastly, metaphysics, which examines the fundamental nature of reality, including the relationship between mind and matter, substance and attribute, and between potentiality and actuality. And philosophers have dived into literally everything from atomic theory, post-death experience, biology, botany, chemistry, ethics, history, logic, rhetoric, philosophy of the mind and of the science, physics, poetics, political theory, psychology, and zoology. It's one of the most broad areas of study, I suppose. So why would these guys who were into learning, into understanding, not appreciate what Paul had to say? So I dug a little bit deeper to find out who they were and what they believed. And so now we'll look at what the Stoics and Epicureans, the two groups that he ran into there, thought. I found a good summary by two guys, Mark Moore and Mark Scott, which I borrowed from pretty significantly for the following section. But it does do a nice job outlining what they believed. So the Epicureans. Who were these guys? So they are philosophers that followed the teaching of Epicurus, who lived from 341 to 270 BC. I think I have a typo there. Anyway, so he was from the Athenian colony of Samos, and he taught his students in the garden, and they were required to learn their doctrines by heart. He had more devoted followers and bitter enemies than any of the early philosophers. However, nobody else from his school rose to prominence, and he's the only one that's known. So some of their major tenets included pleasure is the highest end of living. So this would include good pleasure, such as generosity, fellowship, helping others, and also hedonistic pleasure. Epicurus defined it as follows. By pleasure, we mean the absence of pain in the body and of trouble in the soul. So anything that feels good, do it. Matter, they believed, was eternal, that the world wasn't created by a deity, and they thought nothing could ever be created by divine power out of nothing. They also thought that death is final. There's no hope in eternal or anything after death. They denied the immortality of the soul, and they denied any future retribution for actions here, a final judgment, for instance, or an accountability of what you do here. They also believed acquiring friends is absolutely vital, probably because they didn't believe in an afterlife, and without friends would be horribly depressed. They denied the providential control over human affairs, divine control over human affairs. They thought we had free will, and the gods might be out there, but they would be too far removed from us to have anything to do with us after creation. So, and again, matter's eternal. So they had a very interesting worldview, I guess I'd call it. And while you may not have heard of the Epicureans, you certainly heard of some of these beliefs, right? I mean, they're pretty common today. They sought to debunk traditional religion, its oracles, divination, magic, etc., because they saw religion as a source of fear, and that would cause trouble in your soul, and that would ruin the ability to have a good life free from concern and just seek pleasure. It would disturb your soul, and therefore was bad for you. They also believe that perception is the basis of all reason, pure empirical epistemology. So if you can't see it, it doesn't exist. Only things that you can see are there. So at this point, I think you can get an idea that they are basically atheistic hedonists, and it could be argued that's an oversimplification, but regardless, they wouldn't really appreciate Paul talking about a future judgment or accountability, because that's going to disturb your soul and you'll have to make some life changes. I guess they're a slight twist on conventional hedonism, because Epicurus would promote the avoidance of pain as not, so he wouldn't drink too much because it would cause pain the following day. So he would use temperance, but only in a way to maximize pleasure. And he also taught that spiritual pleasure is better than carnal pleasure. So pleasure of the soul or the mind are higher than the pleasures of the body, but they're all good. That just get as much as you can. Diogenes, who is not Diogenes the Cynic, which probably doesn't mean anything to anybody, but it's the other Diogenes, he summed up Epicureanism as nothing to fear in God, nothing to fear in death, good/pleasure can be attained, evil/pain can be endured. So that's the Epicureans that he ran into, Paul, that day. We were part of the crowd, right? So when some mocked, it's pretty clear why that might have happened. With a background and a worldview like this, they're not going to be very open to hearing Paul preach the gospel. Next, the Stoics. A quick background on them. They are a philosophical school founded by Zeno of Citium, and they're called Stoics because he held classes on his porch, and the porch was called the Stoa, and that's how it came to be Stoics. There were a number of famous Stoics that arose after him, and when I say famous, I don't mean famous like celebrity, but famous as in, people in the area of study would know who they were. Aratus of Soli, he was a Stoic. Paul actually quotes him in Acts 17:28, which I would say makes him pretty famous. Even if you didn't know his name, you definitely read his material. And he was, at the time, read by most Greek students and a prominent writer along the lines of Homer at the time is what I found. Other famous Stoics, Seneca, which maybe you've never heard of, but he was a contemporary of Paul. He could have possibly been present in Acts 17, and later on we'll look at some of his specific teaching. But he was also the brother of Gallio, the preconsul of Achaia, who's mentioned in Acts 18:12-17, which, for the record, Gallio doesn't have a huge part, but what it says is, and when Gallio was the deputy of Achaia, the Jews made insurrection with one accord against Paul and brought him to the judgment seat. And later on, Gallio, in verse 4, and when Paul was now about to open his mouth, Gallio said unto the Jews, if it were a matter of wrong or wicked lewdness, O Jews, reason would that I should bear with you. But if it be a question of words and names and of your law, look ye to it. So he drove him from the judgment seat. So that's So what? I guess it just is amazing to me because that puts all these things in the history books as well as in the Bible, and it's just another layer of proof that this is real, which I appreciate. But Seneca was also the tutor of the Roman Emperor Nero, and he had significant influence over him for a while. But as Nero went over deeper and deeper off the deep end, he tried to resign as his advisor twice. Nero refused both times, and eventually Nero had him killed when there was a conspiracy against Nero in 65 AD, and so he ends up killing himself by just cutting himself and bleeding out. But overall, he was one of the philosophers who was closest to Christianity, but it's also said that he didn't live what he preached. For example, he didn't seem to try to stop Nero in some of the evil things he did, which probably was a good idea for staying alive. But it's, if you really believe it, then why wouldn't you?
Who was that again?
Seneca?
Okay, so
He was also, he preached indifference to material wealth, but actually had at least 4 estates from Rome to Egypt. And was it also, well, anyway, that's enough about him. So he had personal failings, but I think he also had a number of good points, and we'll look at that a little bit later on. So another famous Stoic you may have heard of is Epictetus, and he taught that philosophy is a way of life, not just a theoretical discipline. So, and Marcus Aurelius, who was a Stoic and the Emperor of Rome. So their major beliefs was the world was created by Zeus, and that everything is governed by the fates. So it's a very deterministic worldview. You don't have any choices. It's all going to happen regardless. And the more you can accept what happens, the better off you're going to do in life. They thought that self-denial contributes to the highest end in life. There was a desire they had to suppress all passions, good, bad, happy, sad, all of them. Indifference to pain and pleasure, and mastery over all lusts. But they thought that in such indifference to everything in the world, that one found contentment, and self-control was their supreme virtue. They thought that the soul was not immortal, but existed until the destruction of the universe. And then they disagreed. Some said at that point the soul would be destroyed, and others thought that it would be absorbed into the divine essence. So very different from Paul's perspective, I'm sure. They also thought that everything is material or nothing is immaterial, including the gods. They came to believe in the Logos as another word for God, which I think is interesting. But the reason that they believed that Logos was God was because the Logos maintains order and balance, and that's important. So they thought that knowledge was empirically gained. You started with nothing when you're born. You don't have any preconceived notions. It's called tabula rasa, and it's the opposite of what some people say, where we're born with innate knowledge of things. It's called innatism, where your mind is actually born with concepts, such as like, it's basic extension of when we see animals do things that they could never have learned. Well, they didn't believe in that. They thought that everything had to be learned and you start with nothing. So that's what they thought. And again, you can see why, even though they were self-professed lovers of wisdom, they probably wouldn't have thought Paul had a lot of good things to say. So next, I want to kind of look at some of the similarities and differences between the two and see what we see there. So the similarities between the Stoics and the Epicureans. They were the 2 major philosophical schools of the day. And as major schools, they were often at odds. They were both looking to separate people from fate. The Epicureans, by denying the validity of fate, and the Stoics, by just not responding, at least externally, at least emotionally, to the consequences of fate, either pleasurable or painful. They just suppress all response and all emotion all the time. So they were both looking to become self-sufficient and unaffected by externals, and both placed a heavy emphasis on ethics, at least outwardly. The Epicureans and Christians had a few things in common, but very little. They both had a very tight-knit community. They used similar terminology from time to time. You can understand why the Epicureans believed friendship was vital, probably as an antidote for depression, and the Christians believed that community is essential because we're required to meet in a church. And we're also told in Matthew 18:20, where 2 or 3 are gathered together in my name, there am I in the midst of them. So being together is important. Both the Christians and the Epicureans were accused of being atheists. The Epicureans because they were atheists, and the Christians because they just denied every single prominent god of the time, the entire pantheon of Greece and Rome. So they both were thought of as atheists, but only the Epicureans really were. Then they were both focused on the good of the soul over the good of the body. Very different reasons for doing that, but that is a similarity. I mean, a Christian did control their body because of final judgment. They would control their body to maximize the fun you can have while you're here. So that's the similarities between the Epicureans and the Christians. Between the Stoics and the Christians, they had a little bit of the overlapping terminology, just like we saw the logos. They also talked about conscience, virtue, self-sufficiency, things like that, which, okay. They were aware of humankind's persistent battle with evil, or original sin, as a Christian will call it. And they also both thought there was a human kinship with the divine, so to speak. So if you go any deeper than that, they would disagree. But Christians believe that man is descended from Adam, who was created by God, and the Stoics were pantheists, believing that everything is God and we all have a little bit of the divine in us. Something that is still fairly common today. Both the Christians and the Stoics would deny the world's values, thinking that getting as much as you can isn't really the purpose of life. And they both put emphasis on inner freedom regardless of external circumstances. There are also a good many differences between the Stoics and Christians, and they by far outweigh the similarities. To the Stoics, God wasn't personal. They, like I said, were pantheists, believing that reality is God, everything is God. That word comes from the Greek word pan, meaning all, and theos, meaning God. So everything is a little bit divine, and from that you end up with a whole bunch of issues. But Christians see the world as purposefully created with both a beginning and an end. And the Stoics wouldn't agree with this. Christianity appealed more to the masses, while Stoicism was more for the elite. Stoicism was focused on ethics from a philosophical point of view, where Christianity was preaching ethics as obedience to a divine power, a personal divine power, and again, there's not much commonality between the two. Stoicism doesn't have a personal continued existence, so there's no personal immortality. Like a Christian hopes to go to heaven and still be basically the same person. Well, they thought of a divine spark in each of us that would either be destroyed or reabsorbed into the whole of God. Christianity is supposed to be optimistic and full of joy because of the hope of eternal happiness with a perfect God, whereas Stoics would subjugate all emotional expression, including joy and hope. And also Christians were focused and motivated by love for God and following His commandments, and love of the brethren and of all men, to do no evil and to help others. Whereas Stoics were motivated primarily by self-respect, which makes sense if you think of yourself as part God. There's no such thing as too much self-respect. You're just worshiping a small section of God. So the Stoic thinking has maintained fairly well through the ages, but the school itself has disappeared from the mainstream. But you could still see their influence in philosophy, psychology, New Age religions, evolutionary science, and secular humanism, which secular humanism is the belief that humans are capable of being ethical and moral without religion or belief in a deity. So their teaching is still out there, even if their school really isn't. So that's a quick overview of what they believed. And you could see from that why it wouldn't be as smooth sailing as it might look at first when Paul preaches in Athens. But with both of those schools present. And we already saw some mocked, some said, we'll hear you again, and others said, others stuck to Paul and the truth. But despite all these issues, I think it's really interesting. Paul actually quotes the pagan philosophers in Acts 17 during his message to these guys. I think it's really interesting for a couple reasons. One, they would know who these guys were. They would find this as an effective argument, effective support for Paul's points, because they already knew and respected these poets. And poets were a lot more highly regarded then than they are today, because in the Greek culture, the arts were inspired by the muses, which were goddesses of art, literature, history, and practically everything. So a poet would have the credibility of a prophet to the Jews because it's divinely inspired messages that they're conveying. And maybe they might even have more credibility to the Greeks because the Jews weren't real keen on listening to the prophets. So who knows, it might even be more effective. I also think it's interesting that during this short speech we read early this morning, and when he's speaking to the masses, Paul takes the time to support his arguments and use citations and support what he's saying with something that's going to make sense to his audience. It also means that Paul must have been fairly well versed in these pagan writings. So there are two pagan philosophers / poets he quotes in Acts 17. The first one is in Acts 17:28, where he says, "For in him we live and move and have our being, as certain also of your own poets have said, for we are also his offspring." "We are also his offspring" was originally said by Aratus of Soli in his hymn to Zeus, but it's a little bit edited. Paul only takes a section that applies and then applies it to the true God. And then, "For in him we live and move and have our being" is attributed to Epimenides, who is a Cretan philosopher who lived around 600 BC. And at the time of the 9th century, there was a commentary on Acts that contained the full quote from Epimenides. And what he was basically saying, so there's two parts that he says. He was also the original guy who said the Cretans are always liars, evil beasts, slow bellies. So the original quote was him condemning the Cretans for making a tomb for Zeus, who can't die as a god. But Paul truncates it and just takes the applicable part and applies it to the living and true God in a way that his audience would no doubt be familiar. So the original quote was, "They fashioned a tomb for you, high and holy one, Cretans, always liars, evil beasts, idle bellies. But you're not dead, you live and abide forever. For in you we live and move and have our being." So Paul actually quotes sections of that twice, the first time in Acts and then another time in Titus 1:12, where he says, the Cretans are always liars, evil beasts, slow bellies. So was Paul just a big fan of Epimenides? Or was he a widely known, incredible source? I mean, he probably was, but I think it's really interesting that he made it into the Bible, which is divinely inspired, while being a pagan philosopher and poet. Also fun is there's a famous paradox from the second quote. So Epimenides calls all Cretans liars, but he himself is a Cretan. So if what he says is true, then he's a liar, which means what he said is false, which would mean he's not a liar and what he said is true. And you just can ride that in circles until you get off. I mean, the simplest version of the paradox is this sentence is false. It's the same thing. But it's really interesting that, I don't know, I think it's funny that that is one of the things he's known for, and it actually made it into the Bible as, you believe the creation? It's like the lying whitefoot, truthful blackfoot joke or something like that. But we're also warned a lot about philosophy in the Bible. And after looking at what they believed and some of the conclusions that they came to, just searching the universe with their own eyeballs and trying to come up with what truth is, you could see why. So some of the warnings the Bible has, actually, let me just change directions here. So the Bible itself is a book of philosophy, and it has a complete school of thought, and its teachings are very much like other schools, except for without error and perfect and holy. I've always admired, I guess, some of the philosophers and what they were able to come up with, but only in smaller sections. As a whole, what we find is their worldview is very poor, but their individual points on how to live are quite good. So, despite that, they still miss some of the key things that should be very obvious, such as what we read in Romans 1:20. For the invisible things of him from the creation of the world are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made, even his eternal power and Godhead, so they are without excuse. And both of these schools did not really know what God was in any sort of specific way. And again, the Bible has generally negative things to say about philosophy. We're warned against it in Colossians 2. If you want to flip there, Colossians 2:8. Colossians 2:8, beware lest any man spoil you through philosophy and vain deceit, after the tradition of men, after the rudiments of the world, and not after Christ. To spoil is to plunder. So you can be robbed. You can be robbed of the most precious thing that you have, which is the truth. So don't get plundered by philosophy. And what is vain deceit? It's worthless trickery. And I want to look at one example of that in a minute. But you notice how he also says, after the rudiments of the world, which is fascinating because the rudiments are the fundamental principles of a subject. And that is what philosophers were always interested in. What is the world made of? What happens when you do this? The science and the background, how everything fits together. So be careful who you listen to, especially if they're a philosopher and involved in a lot of vain deceit. I think you could stay on pretty firm footing if you remember that the Bible is first true and not to be understood through anything else, a philosopher, a priest, or a false teacher. William Tyndale said it really well in his book, The Obedience of the Christian Man, and he was talking about the importance of having the Bible in a mother tongue, and what he said was, if I must first believe the doctor, which was a doctor like a PhD, a doctor of the law, or a teacher, then is the doctor first true, and the truth of the Scripture dependeth on his truth. So the truth of God springeth of the truth of man. So if you have to have the Scripture interpreted to you, then that's more true than what it actually says. And then he goes on to say, what is the cause that we damn some of Origen's works and allow some? How know we that some are heresy and some is not? By the Scripture I trow. How know we that St. Augustine, which is the best or one of the best that ever wrote upon the Scripture, wrote many things amiss at the beginning, as many other doctors do, verily by the Scriptures, as he himself well perceived afterward when he looked more diligently upon them, and revoked many things again. He wrote of many things which he understood not when newly converted, ere he had thoroughly seen the Scriptures, and followed the opinions of Plato and the common persuasions of man's wisdom that were then famous. So always believe God first. So Paul's warning is really important because some seemingly intelligent philosophical arguments can create doubt where there shouldn't be. And that is really what got Eve in trouble in the beginning, creating doubt and then tripping up her. Now that was with malicious intent, but at the same time, doubt of the truth is dangerous. So one of the, I want to take an example from Epicurus of what I would call vain deceit. So we all see that there's evil in the world, or pain and suffering at least. And is that, so where did that pain and suffering come from? How do we explain the problem of pain? So what Epicurus said was, is God willing to prevent evil, but not able? Then he is not omnipotent. Is he able to prevent evil, but not willing? Then he is malevolent. Is he both able and willing? Then from whence comes the evil? And I think how he presents it is really interesting. Most people back then believed in God. And he's smart enough not to just proclaim that God doesn't exist. He leads the audience to that conclusion of their own agreement. Is God willing to prevent evil but not able? Well, you only have one answer. He's not omnipotent. Oh, okay, well, you have to kind of step along with him. It's a great example of being, or anybody who would follow that reasoning would be a great example of 2 Corinthians 11:3, where Paul talks about, as the serpent beguiled Eve through his subtlety, so your mind should be corrupted from the simplicity that is in Christ. And he also has a couple logical fallacies built into his argument. So we see him purporting that God must be less than the Bible proclaims him to be. And however brilliant it sounds on the surface, it lacks the ingredients to really prove anything. So the first issue is equivocation, which is an informal fallacy resulting from the use of a particular word or expression in multiple senses within an argument. Or what I like to call it, and one of my professors called it, is a weasel word. That's where you take a word and you use it in one sense and then you use it in another sense in the same argument. For example, a feather is light. Light can't be dark, therefore a feather can't be dark. And what I did there was I took light to mean not heavy and light to mean bright, and came up with a false conclusion. Or you could say taxes are a true headache. Painkillers make headaches go away. Therefore, painkillers can make taxes go away. Well, I'm using headache in two senses. That's the weasel word. And he does it with evil. What does he mean by evil? Well, can we say that man is plagued by suffering, physical ailments and problems? Yeah, most people would say that that's evil. But when you stop and you say, well, what does evil mean? Well, it's immoral or wicked, not pain and suffering. So before you can call anything evil, you first have to know, you have to have a standard on what moral is, what good versus evil is. You have to have a measuring stick. As C.S. Lewis said in Mere Christianity, my argument against God was that the universe seemed so cruel and unjust. But how had I got this idea of just and unjust? A man does not call a line crooked unless he has some idea of a straight line. What was I comparing the universe to when I called it unjust? So what is Epicurus comparing it to when he says it's evil? If there's no God and matter is eternal and humans evolved, there is no evil. There's only things that happen to suit you or things that don't. Is it evil that an insect dies or a tree grows or a star burns out? I mean, you have to have a measuring stick to determine evil or good, and he's left without one other than secular humanism, where you can say, okay, we're going to come up with our own laws and our own morals, but you can't really judge God on the basis of your measuring stick, which is what he's doing. So, and then there's also some disagreement too, right? So if we say that man can make a measuring stick worthy of measuring good and evil, some people think stealing is wrong, while other people make a living out of it. So you can't, who's right? They both evolved from the same group. They're both perfectly meaningless in the broad sense of the term, because there is no value to mankind. If it all just happened, matter's eternal, we're all just here. There's no God, no way to tell what's good, what's evil. So he's using evil as what doesn't happen to suit him and what most people will agree with as evil, but really just means something that he doesn't like. But that's not really what he should, that doesn't make for a bulletproof argument, first. And second, there is a standard, and that standard is God's law. And we know that, but he didn't. So, assuming that the translations are correct, and that is actually what he said, he's using evil to mean something that doesn't please him, such as the suffering of himself or others. But we know that God created all things good and very good, and it was man who broke everything with sin, and it's God's judgment that pain even exists now. So he is, his reasoning ends prior to exploring all the alternatives. The original very good garden was destroyed by man, who just reaps what he originally sowed and deserves every bit of the evil that corrupts the world, as he calls it. But so that's the second thing he makes. The second mistake he makes. He presents a line of reasoning ending with only two alternatives that exclude other possible answers. So you can say that it's either A or it's B, but it could actually be C or anything else. And it's a logical fallacy called the false dichotomy, or the black and white, a false dilemma, or the black and white fallacy is what I've heard it referred to as most often. Whereas you're saying, okay, well, based on this, it's either black or it's white. Well, it might not be. It could be blue. It could be some shade of gray, something between those two. And he doesn't allow for that. He either gives you God is evil, malevolent, or he's not. He's either there or he's not. So he says, is God able but not willing to stop evil? Well, then he's malevolent. But that's an incomplete view, because he doesn't believe that there's going to be a final judgment where the evil will be stopped and fully punished and taken into account. So God isn't necessarily malevolent, though he doesn't stop evil at this point in time. So again, C.S. Lewis said, when you argue against him, meaning God, you're arguing against the very power that makes you able to argue at all. It's like cutting off the branch you're sitting on. So we see that these bad premises lead to bad conclusions and a lot of error. So what can we learn from Paul at Athens? He brought the truth of the gospel to the men of Athens, a place known for wisdom seekers even to this day. And it seems like a path to success, but instead what happens? Some mock, some do nothing, and a few hear and follow. Because it's foolish to the natural man. 1 Corinthians 2:14. In 1 Corinthians 2:14 we read, but the natural man receiveth not the things of the Spirit of God, for they are foolishness unto him, neither can he know them, because they are spiritually discerned. And then again in 1 Corinthians 1:23, but we preach Christ crucified, unto the Jews a stumbling block, and unto the Greeks foolishness. I don't know when Paul wrote that relative to his visit to Athens, but I can't help wonder if those might be the very Greeks, under the Greeks' foolishness, the very Greeks that he spoke to that day in Acts 17. So as we saw, both the Epicureans and Stoics would resist what Paul had to say based on their closely held tenets. If he said that there's a coming judgment and that men should repent and change their ways, they would both kick at the thought. It would go against their premises of the Epicureans not fearing death and seeking only pleasure, and of the Stoics not allowing emotion to lead them to do anything. And if you were to repent, you would be being controlled by the fear of judgment probably, and that would be against their view. So the thought of judgment and punishment for disobedience is extremely likely to unsettle the mind and disturb your natural state, accepting the moment as it presents itself. So it wouldn't be well received. In addition, they were probably too busy being puffed up with what they knew. I mean, so the Stoics thought they were imbued with a divine spark, which is somewhat true, but it's not at all how they perceived it. If you say that it was originally started by God and that man was made in the image of God, I guess I could kind of agree, but that man is still God and has a little piece of God inside of him is absolutely off the deep end. But we know that in 1 Corinthians 8:1-2, knowledge puffeth up, but charity edifieth. And these guys were known for their wisdom, and they had a whole order of students, so no doubt they were considered very knowledgeable and likely puffed up. And if any man think he knoweth anything, he knoweth nothing yet as he ought to know. So those are a few of the issues that they would have had with his teaching, but there certainly could be many others as well. So that's the end of the section on that. And I want to look at now a few of the really good points that they had. Primarily from the Stoics. The Epicureans didn't really have anything that I thought was worthwhile. When you seek pleasure as the chief good, there's just not a lot of moral value. The only thing you can say is temperance, but it's temperance to do evil, so it's a mess. But the Stoics actually had a few good points, and I want to look at those and then compare them with what the Bible says. And what we're going to find in every case is what they say is good and what the Bible says is better. So, it really brings to mind Psalms 119:99, where David says that, I have more understanding than all my teachers, for thy testimonies are my meditation. So the following examples are primarily from Seneca, but also from a handful of others, but if I don't say it's from Seneca, but they're all Stoics. So the first one Seneca said was, exercise the mind. Exercise it day and night. Only a moderate amount of work is needed for it to thrive and develop. It's a form of exercise to which cold and heat and even old age are no obstacle. And that was from his Letters from a Stoic. That's good. It's important to exercise your mind, but what does the Bible say? Proverbs 4:5. Get wisdom, get understanding, forget it not, neither decline from the words of my mouth. So, exercising the mind can be from a number of, you can do that with a number of devices. For instance, Sudoku, or you could do crosswords, or you could do any number of things that would do that. And yes, it will help your recollection and your speed of thought, but it certainly won't necessarily give you wisdom, which is obtained through a very specific type of mental exercise. So it's good to exercise your mind. It's better to seek and get wisdom. And Proverbs 4:7, wisdom is the principal thing, therefore get wisdom, and with all thy getting, get understander. Exalt her, and she shall promote thee. She shall bring thee to honor when thou dost embrace her. She shall give to thine head an ornament of grace, and a crown of glory shall she deliver to thee. So you get that from working your mind in one sense, but you are working in a specific way to gain understanding, studying and learning, not just exercising your mind. So the second one I really like, and it's heal yourself and develop a sound mind, or free yourself from anxiety. So Seneca thought that the minds of humans were broken in two primary ways. The first is the fear of future suffering, and the second is the pain from recollecting past failures or things in the past that hurt. So he said, there are two things then, the recollecting of trouble in the past as well as the fear of troubles to come, that I have to root out. The first is no longer of any concern to me, and the second has yet to be so. And I really like this one because I tend to be a worrier. Anxiety and I go hand in hand. So if I find that when you think about it in his perspective and stay in just the present, things are pretty good. But when you get off into looking at the past or looking at the future, things spiral out of control really, really fast. And again, what's happening in the past or future, what has happened in the past and what may happen in the future are no reason to destroy the present. So if you can, I find that when I can stop worrying about the present, the past, or the future and just stay in the present, it's usually much better, peaceful, things are good. I mean, yeah, there's a lot of things that might go wrong in the future, and if you worry about them, they'll really take a toll on you. But right now, hey, got a place to live, food, raiment, and with that, we should be content. So it's difficult to do, but with practice, I find it really helps. You can talk yourself down. When you're worried about something, you stop. When is this a problem? If it's in the past, it's no longer a concern. If it's in the future, it has yet to be so. So try to stay in the present. And I don't mean to skip learning from things in the past, but when you're done learning from things in the past, let it go. If it keeps haunting you, like I think of mistakes I've made long ago, and the lessons learned, but there's no reason to keep letting it destroy how you are right now, your present state of mind. But the Bible improves on this one as well, by saying, be careful for nothing. And I think it was really a lack of meditation on my part by not realizing that be careful for nothing includes both the past and the future, instead of just thinking of things. Like, oh, don't worry about things. Well, it's broader than that. In Philippians 4:6, if you want to take a look, Philippians 4:6, he says, be careful for nothing, but in everything by prayer and supplication with thanksgiving, let your requests be made known unto God. Be careful for nothing. Again, this includes both the past and the future and everything else. It goes beyond the good human wisdom of Seneca and provides an even better solution by replacing bad things with good. If you're not only you're ending the worrying, but you're also including now prayer, thanksgiving, and requests to God, which can literally help any situation. And when you start praying and giving thanks, the worries of the future and the concerns from the past go away, and you start to just feel so much better by thanking God for what He's done for you and setting your mind to that as opposed to what might happen or what you could have done better. In Philippians 4:7 we read, and the peace of God which passeth all understanding shall keep your hearts and minds through Christ Jesus. So both of these points from Seneca and from the New Testament will help you keep your mind focused on what you need to do now as opposed to what's going on in the future, what's going on, what happened in the past, and it will help you in the present. And again, once I find for myself, whenever I can get rid of worrying about what isn't now, I find now is actually way better than I thought it was, and it's a wonderful thing. In addition, a Christian should especially not worry about the past or the future. Why? Christ has already fixed both of those times. We're forgiven for what we did in the past, and the future He's taken care of forever. So there's no real reason to worry unless you're going to ignore what He told us. Be careful for nothing. He secured your future. There's nothing to worry about there. And no matter what happens in the middle part of our story, it has a happy and glorious ending. So much so that we can't even really understand it. So when I find anxiety coming up again, I try to look at when it's a problem. And it's usually something in the future. And if it's not, it's something in the past. And if it's not, then it's something that you really ought to deal with right now. But most of the time, it's either it's not current, it's something out in the future primarily. So this is a day that the Lord hath made. I will rejoice and be glad in it. You can't do that if you're thinking about the future. This is the day, not the day 2 weeks from now when whatever it is that you're thinking about is going to be a problem. So heal yourself from the past and the future suffering and rejoice today, or better yet, be careful for nothing. Epictetus said, you have 2 ears and 1 mouth. Follow that ratio. Listen more, talk less. The Bible also agrees with this. In Proverbs 17:27, it says, he that hath knowledge spareth his words, and a man of understanding is of an excellent spirit. And then verse 28, even a fool when he holdeth his peace is counted wise, and he that shutteth his lips is esteemed a man of understanding. That was Proverbs 17:27 and 28. And also Proverbs 10:19, in the multitude of words there wanteth not sin, but he that refraineth his lips is wise. So 2 ears, 1 mouth. Try to follow that ratio. Another perfect example of wisdom on how to live, but this is from a Stoic who didn't believe, we already looked at what they believed. It's pretty far afield from the truth. The next one is be content. Seneca said, he is not poor who does not have enough, but he who desires more. And I think that's a really interesting perspective. If you don't, I would argue you could be poor from not having enough, but you know who will always be poor? The person who desires more. They'll never be satisfied, whereas you can be satisfied with less than enough. It's really well written. I think that's a great example of good philosophy. Because it restates something that you're already familiar with, to be content, but in a new way that shines a light on it that maybe you hadn't thought about in quite that perspective, and I think it's really, really rich. But again, how does the Bible improve on this concept? Well, let's look at Hebrews 13, verse 5. In Hebrews 13, verse 5, it says, let your conversation be without covetousness, and be content with such things as ye have, for he hath said, I will never leave thee, nor forsake thee. What need is there in anything else? If you use your mind instead of thinking about what you don't have, and see what the Lord has done and will do, then we ought, of all men, to be supremely contented. Cleanthes said, the wicked man is like a dog tied to a cart and compelled to go wherever it goes. It's a really funny description, but when you think about it, if you're just following your heart, you're going to end up in one of 3 places. The lust of the eyes, the lust of the heart, or the pride of life. And it feels like it could be self-actualization for a while, but you're actually a servant of sin. In Romans 6:16, we read, know ye not that to whom ye yield yourselves servants to obey, his servants ye are to whom ye obey, whether of sin unto death, or of obedience unto righteousness? But God be thanked that ye were the servants of sin, but ye have obeyed from the heart that form of doctrine which was delivered unto you, or delivered you. Being then made free from sin, ye became the servants of righteousness. So the wicked man is like a dog tied to a cart, compelled to go wherever it goes. Jesus said in John 8:31, if you continue in my word, then are you my disciples indeed, and ye shall know the truth, and the truth shall make you free. You're no longer required to follow every desire your heart has. You're free to serve God. And also a couple other verses, Titus 3:3, for we ourselves were also sometimes foolish, disobedient, deceived, serving divers lusts and pleasures, living in malice and envy, hateful, and hating one another. And now you're free from that. 2 Peter 2:19, while they promise them liberty, they themselves are the servants of corruption. For of whom a man is overcome, of the same is he brought in bondage. So the next one, and there's only a couple left here, is live for others. Seneca said, we have neither successes nor setbacks as individuals. Our lives have a common end. No one can lead a happy life if he thinks only of himself and turns everything to his own purposes. You should live for the other person if you wish to live for yourself. A person who shares much with a fellow human being will share everything with a friend. I think that's true. We weren't accidentally organized into a church where human interaction is important and where we're told to help each other and to support and to be there. And also, you notice when Jesus was providing the golden rule, he assumes human interaction. Matthew 12, oh, I missed the citation. Oh well, somewhere in Matthew, therefore, all things whatsoever you would. Wow, that's embarrassing. I really should know where that one is without having it written down. Oh well. Therefore, all things whatsoever you would that men should do to you, do even so unto them, for this is the law and the prophets. So he's assuming that you're going to be dealing with people, which is important. Also, at the beginning of the Lord's Prayer, he starts with Our Father, meaning that, it's not just you. Live for others. And God didn't organize us into a congregation so that we can live totally independently. I think we could also learn from experience. I mean, when you get something new, something that maybe you've wanted for a while, how long can you bask in the glow of that new whatever it is? It gets old. Everything does. It wears out, it breaks. No matter how amazing it is, eventually it gets old. But relationships never have to. You can always learn something else about someone or talk about something new or get someone's insight on some topic that, a new perspective. It doesn't ever get old, or it doesn't have to. When you help others, you feel better yourself. In Galatians 6:10 it says, as we have therefore opportunity, let us do good unto all men, especially to them who are of the household of faith. All right, so got a couple left here. The next one is find role models and be a role model. Seneca said, associate with people who are likely to improve you. Welcome those whom you are capable of improving. The process is a mutual one. Men learn as they teach. Paul said in Philippians 3:17, brethren, be followers together of me, and mark them which walk so as ye have us for an ensample. So be a role model and follow a good one, in this case, Paul. But even better yet, in 1 Corinthians 11:1, he says, be ye followers of me, even as I also am of Christ, which is the perfect role model. The basic idea of learning from others and self-improvement from people who are more experienced or know more than you is a very solid point. But he also ignores some of the potential evils that could happen, because evil communication corrupts good manners, and Proverbs warns us about associating with angry men and learning his ways. In Proverbs 22:24, it says, make no friendship with an angry man, and with a furious man thou shalt not go, lest thou learn his ways and get a snare to thy soul. So again, the Bible improves on the concept by warning of the danger overlooked by Seneca. So we've got two left. Okay. Live purposefully. I think this one's interesting as well. He says, you must not think a man has lived long because he has white hair and wrinkles. He has not lived long, just existed long. For suppose you should think that a man had gone on a long voyage who had been caught in a raging storm as he left harbor, and carried hither and thither and driven round in a circle by opposing winds. He did not have a long voyage, just a long tossing about. So there's a difference between living with purpose and just existing. And I think that's a biblical principle. In Ephesians 5:16 through 18, we're told, redeeming the time because the days are evil. Wherefore, be ye not unwise, but understanding what the will of the Lord is. So he's correct in living purposefully, but he misses the mark as the true purpose, understanding the will of the Lord. So again, the philosopher is outdone by the book. The highest arrow will fall to the ground without a mark, and that's true, but it's incomplete. You need purpose, but also the right purpose. You can order your life as one bent on seeking pleasure, as the Epicureans, and that is a purpose, but instead follow Ephesians 5 and understand what the will of the Lord is. So there's value in his advice, but it falls short as to a complete directional point. And lastly, do not be swept up with the majority. This is also Seneca, when a mind is impressionable and has none too firm a hold on what is right, it must be rescued from the crowd. It is so easy for it to go over to the majority. A Socrates, a Cato, or a Laelius may have been shaken in his principles by a multitude of people different from himself. A single example of extravagance or greed does a lot of harm. A wealthy neighbor provokes cravings in one. A companion with a malicious nature tends to rub off some of his rust on someone of an innocent and open-hearted nature. What then? Do you imagine the effect on a person's character is when the assault comes from the world at large? Inevitably, you must either hate or imitate the world. But the right thing is to shun both courses. You should neither become bad because they are many, nor be an enemy of the many because they are unlike you. He's very correct in teaching that the crowd is typically wrong. Matthew 7:13 and 14 says, "Enter ye in at the strait gate, for wide is the gate and broad is the way that leadeth to destruction, and many there be that go in thereat. Because strait is the gate and narrow is the way which leadeth unto life, and few there be that find it." So I've actually talked to people who think that the more acceptance an idea has, the more likely it is to be true, which is another logical fallacy, which is called the appeal to common belief or the bandwagon fallacy. For instance, McDonald's, right? They have signs that say billions and billions served. Why? Well, that makes you feel like, hey, billions and billions of people can't be wrong, right? It has to be a top-notch product that's safe and healthy to consume. Is that true? So he's right to warn against the crowd, but he fails in pointing you in the right direction. Don't just forget the crowd and do something different. Forget the crowd and follow God along the straight and narrow. So that wraps it up. I hope that it was interesting. I had a lot of fun putting it together. But Paul definitely would have had an uphill battle with these philosophers who were probably quite worldly and wise in their own conceits, and whose premises and teaching were very far removed from truth. They had a lot of great life lessons in the micro sense on how to handle individual problems, but they were drastically lacking in the macro view meaning of life. So you can study philosophy and philosophers and learn to live well, but you'll have to do a lot of weeding to find the truth, and you'll always come up short compared to the student of the Bible, because the foolishness of God is wiser than man. 1 Corinthians 1:25. So thank you for your time.